Okay, are we ready to go? Right? Okay, super. So, yeah, welcome everyone to this amazing event and lecture. So we are very much looking forward, especially to the keynote of John Tresch tonight. So you came from London here to Berlin, and it's fantastic to have you here. And before I properly introduce you in a minute, I'm going to just say some words about like this festival series and the activities that have been taking place in the last couple of days. And just to introduce myself, I'm Claudia Marais, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Cluster of Excellence, Matters of Activity, Image, Space, Material. And I'm very happy that Maxime and Yuna invited me to just give a short introduction, also on behalf of the directors of the clusters and the members of the cluster. As you might have seen and experienced, so this lecture series tonight is actually the closing event of the Stretching Sense School Festival, which took place over the last 3 days. So it was a very exciting mix, I feel, of on the one hand really featuring like virtual reality artworks from ongoing research at the Cluster Matters of Activity. So you might have had the chance to visit some of those installations in this space here or below in the other museum exhibition space of the Tieranatomische Theater. And there was also kind of a workshop series attached to the festival, and as well a couple of lectures, including lectures from Tim Morton, Dominique Boyer, Lisa Messeri, and tonight John Tresch. I would like to congratulate and also thank to the curators of this amazing series, that is Maxime Le Calvé and Yuna Kim. So you see them here on the side, and assisted also by Andel, who is also around here tonight. And I just would like to express my great admiration for this spectacular event. Obviously, it's always a bit of also like an exploratory project to bring together this different kind of knowledge production and also really keep technology going and, you know, being cared about the visitors and so on. And I feel you did a great job in hosting this and organizing this. There is like an overarching topic of the current festival that is dedicated to the topic of virtual reality, wordings for planetary emergency. And there is also a special focus again on the thematic of planetary health. And by having this thematic framework, the festival brought together different projects that evolved out of a co-educative experiment between multimodal ethnography and anthropology on the one hand, and immersive interaction art. So it's really like a project that bridges science and art. And it basically asks for the many modes and modalities of how we can stretch our senses to explore the world at different scales, and use these multi-scalar and also multimodal experiences in order to generate other understandings of the many worlds we might inhabit or might not inhabit. So this attempt also includes that we can learn kind of different kind of stretching the senses. And if I read from like the description of the festival, it's really about, to quote, feeling limestone growing from the inside and seeing its dispersion as urban landscape, experiencing an amphitheater through vibrations of willow branches, that is here, the installation, reaching out to the hidden electrical energy of things around us, touch the surface of cellular tissues, end of quote. So in this sense, it's not only about the human experience that is mediated technologically or medially, but rather it's about a playful but nevertheless serious attempt of a sensory regime that transcends the human senses also towards a more than human register. And I also think it's important to emphasize that this festival, this sense of school stretching sense of school festival is not just a singular event, but it's really, it developed out from a whole series of activities, and it's also part of a longer process of testing out the possibilities and potentials of how you can really use exhibition-led, practice-led, artistic-led research within the context of matters of activity, the cluster. So specifically, the festival is a continuation of the exhibition Stretching Materialities that took place here at the Tieranatomische Theater earlier this year. And it's also, it came out of a series of teaching experiments that have been entitled Stretching Senses School. And also this school has been curated by Maxime and Yuna And it was just an amazing way also to generate this kind of knowledge production. And I would also want to quote from the school. They wrote, it's about a playful approach that can directly affect our senses beyond power and knowledge, end of quote. So of course, if we talk about power and knowledge and the way to somehow enable these other kinds of sensing and enabling it, or enabling them, I feel it's also always about the various technological and media dispositives, and also the ways of worlding, the epistemological and ontological ways of worlding that enable us eventually to not just experience but also to make sense of those experiences. And I feel that is a good lead into our speaker of today, John Tresch, and to his talk that is entitled Matter and Sense, Stretch Backward, Hermetic Instruments, Romantic Machines. And the talk will be, and I hope this is still like an actual information about historical precedents in thinking and experiencing ways in which embodied engagements with precision science and technology, including virtual reality interfaces, could remake the limits of matter and sense. So it really has this genealogical approach and this genealogical view on stretching the senses backwards. And that again might be helpful to also rethink what history can bring into this other kind of sensory experiments, maybe as a way of seeing and experiencing the world differently or experiencing it otherwise. So in this sense, we are looking very much forward to John's elaboration and also how they will then again resonate with the installations in this room. But before, I would just like to, as promised, properly introduce John Tresch. Many of you know him. He's the Mellon Chair and Professor of History of Art, Science and Folk Practice at the Warburg Institute at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. And it almost goes without saying that here in Berlin, especially in the context of the Anatomisches Theater and Helmholtz Center, we have, for Kulturtechniken, we have a very, I would say, close and affectionate relationship with the legacy of Abi Warburg. And so this is obviously a very great chance also to encounter the research that is being carried out at this institution. John Tresch holds degrees in anthropology and social sciences, and he has been an ancien élève de l'École Normale Supérieure à Paris. And his PhD he received in history and philosophy of science at Cambridge University. Between 2005 and 2018, he taught history and sociology of science at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and he has held fellowships at the New York Public Library, the Institute for Advanced Studies, as well as the Max Planck Institute for History of Science here in Berlin, and he has been visiting researcher at King's College London and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. In his research, John examines changing methods, instruments, and institutions in the sciences, arts, and media from the early modern period to the present, as well as connections among disciplines, practices, and cosmology. He has published 2 seminal books on 19th century sciences and their connection to technology, art, literature, and politics. So the 2 monographs of his is first The Reason for the Darkness of the Night, Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science, which is a thrillingly comprehensive biography of Edgar Allan Poe and has been published in 2021. The other, and is about to be translated in many languages, actually Spanish, Polish, Russian, Serbian, so very exciting. And the second book from 2012, The Romantic Machine, Utopian Science and Technology After Napoleon, published at University of Chicago Press, as I said, in 2012. And this book has won numerous awards and special mentionings, including the Pfizer Award for Outstanding Book in History of Science, awarded by the History of Science Society in 2013. Last but not least, I just wanted to briefly mention his current book project, that is Cosmograms, How to Do Things with Worlds, which is also planned to be published at University of Chicago Press. And there in this book, John approaches the history of natural knowledge through objects used to represent the universe. He's also developing a research project on relations among social forms, cosmologies, and environments, focused on the 19th, 20th, and 21st century atlases. So I think I have spoken far too long for now, so I'm very happy to have you here, John. I'm thrilled, and I hand over to you and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I feel I can stop now. Basically, you know what I'm going to say. But I won't. I'm going to give a talk that is based on research I've been doing over several years, but rethinking it based on the planned events here when I'd heard about them. And I don't think I actually have to change them much now that I've been here to see the exhibitions. So thank you very much, Claudia, for the introduction, and thank you, Maxime and Yuna, for all your help and for the invitation. And thanks to all of you for being here. It's a beautiful day outside, and there's other places you could be. So I'm grateful to you for being here and to hearing me in English. So thanks for that. Also, obviously, this is an incredibly appropriate place for me to be speaking, and you'll partly see why in a minute, but one of the things I'm very interested in is technologies of display and seeing things all at once, and that's where we are. I'm the horse being dissected here this time, but at a certain point later in the talk, you'll have a chance to imaginatively put yourself in the circus ring. So I also want to thank the presenters, the inventors, the designers, and artists who put together the 4 exhibits that I saw earlier. I was expecting to be impressed, but I was much more impressed than I was expecting. They really lived up to the interesting proposal of sensing matter and extending matter, stretching the senses, stretching materials, which is a pretty hard task. Through the virtual environment, through the virtual medium, you left or gained a really striking sense of your own embodiment in materiality, and I wasn't expecting that at all. Although, there was the option of giving this talk online, and I realized somewhat, or I suspected, and it was proven, that perversely or paradoxically, in order to really understand virtual reality, at least in the form it currently exists, you have to be there in person. You have to be there talking with other people. You have to be embodied. You have to feel the materials that go along with it. So thanks for putting this together, and I've really enjoyed learning here. Hopefully, the talk, you'll hear lots of points of connection with your artworks and what you've experienced in the exhibitions. So the starting point for my talk and for a lot of my research is the assumption that's pretty well baked into the history and philosophy of science, that there's a extremely strong, if not inseparable, connection between the machines that people use to study the world, whether that's electric or optical or weights, physics, basic physics. The machines that people use to investigate the world are directly connected to a mechanical understanding of the universe. So that there's a bond, a direct and necessary bond between machines and mechanisms, between a certain set of practices and objects and a specific ontology or cosmology, mechanical cosmology. That connection goes back to one of the founders of the experimental method in natural science, Robert Boyle, and it's expressed very clearly in this example. According to me, that is Robert Boyle, the world is like a rare clock, such as that of Strasbourg, where all things are so skillfully contrived that the engine being once set a-moving, all things proceed according to the artificer's first design, by virtue of the general primitive contrivance of the whole engine. So the way we best understand the universe is by likening it to a clock. And this is stated by someone who spent a lot of time working on improving and building machines of observation. So that link between the machines of observation and the mechanical understanding of the universe is really tightly woven. And it's been taken for granted in some of the major works of history of science, like Alexander Coy-Ray's study of essentially modern science as the move into mechanical philosophy from the closed world to the infinite universe. many of which put Newton, the follower of Boyle, as a turning point toward this new modern scientific cosmology. And to summarize that cosmology, to summarize it as both a way of knowing and a thing that is known, as an epistemology and an ontology, this is a useful mnemonic. It's the idea that knowledge and the thing that is known is mechanical, material, and objective. NEMO for short, so it's a memo. You cannot forget it, you cannot neglect it. That's what makes for real science, and that's what makes for reality. And even as we've had many new machines, many new technologies in the century since Boyle and Newton, even though we've had many different branches and forms of knowledge in the different sciences and disciplines that have shown up since that time, which don't necessarily even closely follow this model. Even so, I think that it's legitimate to say that that idea, that material, mechanical, and objective, is the defining characteristic of true knowledge, and therefore of what it means to live in the real world, remains. It's there as a kind of backstop, a kind of baseline assumption of what knowledge is and what reality is. It's what Philippe Descola calls naturalism. It's the cosmology that moderns tend to inhabit. But as we know, we're reminded from the title of planetary emergence, this way of approaching nature as though it were something radically distinct from us, right, whose parts are all mechanically interrelated and is dead mechanical matter, has led to forms of extraction and production and exploitation whose byproducts we're dealing with in all kinds of unpredictable and frightening ways, in all kinds of pathological ways. By assuming no difference between, or a radical difference that is, assuming a radical difference between human subjectivity and natural objectivity, we have mined the earth, we have created byproducts, pollutants, we have altered the landscape in ways that are coming back to haunt us. That's what's summarized by the term anthropocene. The term suggests that we're no longer separated from nature. Nature is shot through with our intentions, our plans, the things that we've done, knowingly and unknowingly. Human knowledge, industry, and our political and economic choices have shaped that nature. Humans have caused this, and that's sort of the way, the strange way in which Anthropocene almost sounds like a congratulatory title, like way to go humans, way to go Anthropos. You've got an entire geological era named after it. But of course, no one planned it. Only a handful of people, right, certain regions, the wealthy in the north, and their extractive techniques got this process started and have continued to profit from it. And most strikingly of all, no human is in control. Humans have done it, but it's out of our hands. And that consequence of, which is all around us in all kinds of unpredictable ways, of the MIMO way of seeing the world, the mechanical, material, and objective way of seeing the world, leads us here at this exhibition, but in many thinkers in various places, to think whether it's possible to move to other ways of relating to nature, other ways of thinking about cosmology, other ways of thinking about ontology. And my particular question is whether we can think about technology differently, in a way that's better suited to the kind of nature that we now inhabit in the Anthropocene. Can we think about machines without mechanical philosophy, machines without mechanism? Can we keep our technologies and our knowledge without projecting from them an underlying dead mechanical objective nature? Because certainly our technologies are very useful, many of them. They are useful ways of knowing about the world. In medicine, knowing about the pathologies that we've created, the sciences that we have, are crucial. But projecting beyond them to say this is what the natural world must be has led to an assumption of nature as something different from us that we can do with as we please. So can we think about technology in a way that is aligned with other natures, with other cosmologies, other ways of relating to the cosmos, or to use the title's word, other ways of worlding, other ways of making worlds that we're part of, that we're not separate. I'm guided here and inspired by many thinkers, among them Yakui's recent work on cosmotechnics, the idea that different cultures and cosmologies have different ways of understanding technology and therefore relating to nature. And likewise, going further back, André Leroy-Gouron's work on technology, understanding it as an outgrowth of human capacities, woven into different kinds of meshes that form human societies as well as human subjectivity. So to approach this question of whether it's possible to think about machines without mechanism, and in ways that are directly connected, I think, to the exhibition, it turns out that the two case studies I was going to focus on, one from around the early 19th century and one from the Renaissance, around the 16th century, they both serve as a very selective genealogy of virtual reality. Episodes in its history that leads to the kinds of interventions that we see here, the kinds of inventions that we see at this exhibit. And what I find in these different cases, and as I go through them, we'll keep coming back, are a number of recurrent themes. One is that these involve technologies of showing, which are also showings of technology. So new ways of seeing things, but one of the things that is most immediately seen and most immediately displayed, like in the electron scalpel of one of the fantastic exhibits, is new technology, is technologies, the histories of technologies, or the extraction, the technologies of extraction from the caves and the caverns in the history of geology. Let's see. So a technology of showing, which is also a showing of technology. This also involves a theory of knowledge and perception, which is inseparable from hallucination. Right? How we know what we're seeing involves questions about is this a hallucination or not, and often involves the actual generation of persuasive hallucinations. That's a big part of these apparatuses, these setups. And finally, the recurrent theme is the emergence of cosmologies which are centered on technological intervention. Okay, so art or technique are at the core of these cosmologies. But that definition of a cosmology around technology produces an ambiguity. There's two ways this can go. One is to think about technology as unveiling and making visible a fixed world that we then can control and exploit. That I'm summarizing as the Apollonian view. You see it from above, like you're in the chariot of the sun, or the Theoria view, like you just see it projected. And to use a term from Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction author, this is the right-hand approach to nature. It's all fixed and given, and technology is there for us to get to know it and take out of it what we need. But we can also see these technologically centered cosmologies in another way, the left-handed way, which is to see it as a cosmos which is produced in the interaction between those people who know it, who see it, who work with it, and whatever is being worked with, nature and humans, non-humans and humans. Something that emerges, and I think that's what's being suggested by the term worlding, which is so much part of the thinking of this exhibition. So as opposed to there being one world, there are many worlds. And those are two different ways to think about cosmologies based around technology. And I'm certainly leaning toward the left-handed side. There's a real left-handed slant here. But part of what I'm looking at is the ways in which both are present. Both of these ways of reading technologically centered cosmologies are present in these earlier instances of what looks like virtual reality. So yes, I said a genealogy of the present, and that means starting from the present, some of the weird things that we've seen coming from the metaverse of Mr. Zuckerberg, or from the NASA labs. Right? This is where we are. This is part of the discussion and what the imagery around VR. And I do think one of the great things of this exhibition is producing a kind of counter-narrative other ways of thinking about virtual reality that puts bodies, matter, and environmental concerns at the center of this virtual reality. But it is what we've received. And it's grounded in experiments from the 1980s and 70s, like the Aspen Interactive Movie Map, which is made by filming, like Google Maps, the city of Aspen, the mountaintop city of Aspen, driving around it, and then you can drive around it on your video player, on your digital video player, cruising through the streets and visiting different buildings. An obvious precursor to virtual reality. Part of that goes back to the confluence of countercultural ideas, practices of the 1960s and 70s with advanced technology, with digital utopianism. The figure of Stuart Brand has been noted as very prominent here from the Whole Earth catalog, which was about creating local environments, local social scenes that were off the grid or only loosely connected to the grid, autonomous worlds, using new technologies. He went to thinking about how to do that in space colonies, to being one of the big proponents of virtual reality. So there's a real continuity in this shift from counterculture to cyberculture. Stuart Brand really exemplifies it in a lot of ways. He's had a lot of attention lately. And I think this is a place to pause on that ambiguity that I mentioned between two different ways of understanding a cosmos that's oriented around technology. One that is discovered and controlled, or one that's made in the interaction. And Brand's own rhetoric very much goes in the direction of the second. Right? He, at the start of the Whole Earth catalog, he made this famous quote, "We are as gods, and might as well get used to it." This very demiurgic understanding of what, with technology, humans can do to produce new worlds. The connection to LSD, very important for Stuart Brand as part of his imaginary of new worlds, also connects to that understanding of hallucination as a basic theory that that is part of virtual realities. So on the one hand, this somewhat mystical or magical understanding of how we relate to nature, bringing forth new kinds of cosmic possibilities. But I just read a kind of blistering review of a biography about Brand. The biography is called The Whole Earth. This came out 10 days ago in The Nation. And it's kind of like, oh, wow, that hurt. Stuart Brand's still alive, so I hope he hasn't read this. I hope his friends have kept this review from him. But one of the things that the reviewer says is, at one point in time, it was possible to see Brand as the goofy grandfather of a gentler, more thoughtful capitalism, headquartered in San Francisco Bay. Decentralized, but still ambitious, environmentally conscious and techno-optimistic, philosophical, and even spiritual, rather than materialistic and stultified. And that's the "we are as gods" line. If Brand had died before 2008 crash, before Uber and Facebook being used as a tool of genocide, before coal-fired Bitcoin mining plants, he might have secured an uncomplicated legacy. But now we all know better. And the author goes on to say, the one thing Brand has as a through line in all of his works is coming up with clever ideas to sell to rich people. That's basically, according to him, his main skill is branding, being a huckster for various new technologies, which is ultimately that understanding of technology as a way of exploiting, creating individual profit out of a given nature. So those two natures are there even in some of the most recent precursors of contemporary virtual reality. And as we know, the technologies, the corporate structure, the funding structure that went into those early experiments in virtual reality are entirely tied up with the Cold War politics of the US, the second half of the 20th century, the linking between military research, defense research, and corporate investment in places like IBM, all made to align with the interests of a broad public. This is the World's Fair of 1964 and the Cosmic Egg that was on display there, sponsored by IBM, and with the interests of corporate America, Coca-Cola, right around the corner from the IBM Pavilion. So in a way, that duality is not surprising when we just look a little further back than the Whole Earth catalog. What I want to suggest in today's talk is that these elements of virtual reality do have even earlier precursors that are really central to the histories of knowledge and industry and self-understandings in Western countries for a few hundred years. And I want to focus on two case studies. The first, early 19th century. We could go further back before the 20th century just a bit, to the fin de siècle, and think about as precursors for virtual reality, the artificial worlds of symbolist poetry and writing, like in Huysmans, in his book Au Rebours, which is all about creating for himself an aesthete, a perfectly artificial environment where he never has to leave his room in order to experience all the wonders of the world. That vision of an artificial enclosed environment has direct affinities to the growth of the international expositions in the 19th century, where in Paris and many other cities, notably in London in 1851, nature was enclosed in a glass dome, and a milieu or climate was artificially created so that plants, animals, living things could all inhabit something like nature while indoors. It's a perfectly synthetic environment, and it's an anticipation of shopping malls, theme parks like Disney World, and other artificial immersive environments of the same time. There on display was technology. It's a technology of showing and a showing of technology. All the progress of the new industries of the different countries of the world. But the aesthetics of the expositions owed a lot to Romanticism. And this is the duality that I really want to focus on for the 19th century. That this era of the Industrial Revolution, new machines, new production products, were coming online and getting massively distributed and really transforming the landscape as well as transforming labor relations, transforming everyday life, were matched. Right? These developments in technology were directly matched by developments in aesthetics that weren't about the objective world or the world of matter, but the world of subjectivity, the world of imagination, aesthetics, and organicism, that is, Romanticism. So what I've argued is that Romanticism and industrialization wove together in many interesting new formations, especially focused on the new technologies of the early 19th century. Steam engines, photographs, electromagnetic devices, meteorological instruments, ways of knowing the weather, the printing press. All of these were machines, but they were understood as having a demiurgic power, a possibility of creating new kinds of worlds, new kinds of experiences, transforming subjectivity. And in many cases, they were seen as growing directly out of an underlying process of nature. So rather than seeing these machines as being separate from nature, as in the mechanical philosophy, they were outgrowths or products of a natural evolution. A rather different way of seeing machines than the standard mechanical way. This took the form of great public displays, like the Saint-Simonians' bizarre dream of replacing the Cathedral of Notre Dame at the center of Paris with this new kind of pre-Statue of Liberty, this giant 8-foot-story woman made of metal that would have displays of all of the cultures of the world within it and all of their products and arts. So again, a showing of technology in a new technology. Likewise, Auguste Comte, who is connected to the Saint-Simonians, a new theory of knowledge, which is actually a theory of the technical engagements of all the different sciences with different levels of reality, all gathered together in a new environment, the positivist church, a new cathedral, a new immersive experience to teach and show people the unity of nature and the unity of human technical creation. These echo, in various ways, another new technology of visibility, which is the panorama. Obviously a precursor to virtual reality. These were giant cylinders like this, where the walls were painted in highly detailed images of distant places, of historical events, where people were said to faint because it was the illusion was so overwhelming. The same visual aesthetics is present, well, Are you about to faint? Yeah. I'd say we should open a window, but I don't think we can. These are the open ones. Okay. No, I am slightly conscious of this. So just raise a hand if you need a glass of water. So inside our panorama, I want to remind you that even in the sciences, those aesthetic techniques of hyper-real simulation were present and conveyed the new combined mechanical and romantic views of nature, such as someone you've heard a lot about, probably your whole lives, Alexander von Humboldt. And his visit to the Americas, which he brought back various specimens, various rocks, various plants, and also findings, meteorological findings, about the environmental niches that he explored at various altitudes in the Americas, and wove them together in new visual systems, like his famous image from the geography of equatorial plants, where the entire diversity of the South American ecosystem, as it varies from one level of altitude to the next, is shown in a single glance. Clearly, this borrows from conventions of landscape painting, but also remarkable are the data points that are here in each of the columns. And these data points are made possible, as he's very explicit about in the text of this book, they're made possible by the instruments, the technologies he carried with him, or had other people carry with him on the backs of donkeys throughout South America. So every one of these columns correlates to an observation and to an instrument of observation, whether it's temperature, barometric scale, pressure, hygrometry, the wetness of the air, even the blueness of the sky. So again, a technology of showing, which is also a showing of technology. And in this case, it's emphasizing the way in which those technologies make it possible for humans to understand and really weave themselves into the overall symphony of nature. So humans are made part of that ensemble of natural milieux. Around the same time, I want to give a slightly different example of romantic machines. Not necessarily from someone you'd expect, and this is Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote really scary stories, exactly at the time as Humboldt was writing, but he also trained as a scientist at West Point Military Academy. He wrote about science and the new forms of rationality that were emerging in this period, this romantic era, constantly. And near the end of his life, he wrote a cosmology called Eureka and dedicated it to Alexander von Humboldt. And Humboldt, who had just published Cosmos, served as a kind of model for him. So we know him as someone very interested in hallucination, in pathologies, the horrific visions of an irrational mind. But as I mentioned, he's very interested in new technology and science. One in particular is the magic lantern, which is a precursor to the cinema, precursor to virtual reality, very much on display, traveling throughout Europe and the Americas at this time. Celebrated for its more than real, lifelike images of the natural world. And one of Poe's most striking stories, although it's not much read, is The Domain of Arnhem, which I think builds on the Magic Lantern show to become a kind of manifesto for a total work of art, which is an immersive virtual reality. He starts by thinking about a poet who is more ambitious than ordinary poets and dreams of using his pecuniary resources. He happens to have been born extremely rich. He uses that money to build, rather than a poem, a landscape poem, to create his poetic vision in stones and water and plant and flowers and trees. This kind of work would assume the air of an intermediate or secondary nature, a new nature, in the sense of the handiwork of angels hovering between man and God, an angelic art. He then describes what would happen when someone would go through this new kind of Disney world, this new hallucinatory virtual reality, getting into a boat and sailing around or going pulled by imperceptible forces on a stream past trees, past mountains, past waterfalls, until at the end, you're completely plunged into this world. The whole paradise of Arnheim bursts upon the view. There's a gush of entrancing melody. All the senses are activated here. There's an oppressive sense of strange, sweet odor, a dreamlike intermingling to the eye of tall, slender eastern trees, bosky shrubberies, flocks of golden and crimson birds, lily-fringed lakes, hyacinths, intertangled lines of silver streamlets, and then springing up in the midst of it, a massive semi-Gothic, semi-Saracenic architecture sustained as if by miracle in midair, glittering in the red sunlight with 100 oriels, minarets, and pinnacles. This is the last paragraph of the essay, Domain of Arnheim, and it's absolutely a manifesto for a virtual reality, a reality that is heightened 1 degree over natural reality, and that heightening comes through the control of material reality, but especially the senses of the person experiencing it. Underlying it is a pun or a joke or an extension of the theory behind Boyle's likening of nature to a clock. Right? It was likened to a clock that was built by a wise artificer. If nature is the art of God, if nature is divine art, then Poe says, with the right amount of resources, the right imagination, the ability to enact this on a large scale, art is nature continued by other means. So art weaves into nature and heightens it by 1 degree by producing overwhelmingly persuasive, hallucinatory, and more real than real experiences. So whether it's Humboldt in a very direct way, or Poe in a slightly more twisted way, what we have at the start of the 19th century are these new technologies of showing, new ways of immersively putting you into new kinds of experiences, where science and new technologies make it possible, and a big part of what's being displayed is technology itself. Why? It's celebrating the human capacity to imagine as well as to work with nature in order to bring it forth in a usable, entire vision, new vision. And that to me is a 19th century precursor to a lot of what we've been seeing in the 22nd. Which century are we in? 21st? 21st. I anticipate even better stuff in the 22nd. If we make it that far. So my next example jumps back another couple hundred years to the Renaissance. And rather than romantic machines, I want to look at Hermetic instruments. Instruments connected to the Hermetic philosophies of Neoplatonism and magic that really flourished in the 16th century. Quick refresher on some basic points of the Renaissance. It's a time of various dukes and princes racking up huge fortunes, partly through trade with the East, partly through new wealth coming in from the Americas, gathered in new courts where part of the fun is all about putting on great displays, artificial shows, pageants, parties where people dress up as various gods and goddesses, cabinets where wonders of nature and art are gathered together for the delight of viewers. Gardens are places to celebrate the same collecting of resources and play, where the idea of waterfalls like this one at the Villa d'Este suggests that nature has been reproduced or even gone one further by harnessing the growth of the trees and plants, but also channeling water to produce artificial waterfalls, artificial grottos, where it's hard to tell whether the stone in this cave is naturally given, producing this God, lifting it up, or has been produced by art. And that blurring between art and nature has strong connections to a philosophical change showing up in the Renaissance, connected to the arrival of what's called the Byzantine corpus, a bunch of texts in Greek, in Italy in the early years of the 15th century. And this corpus contains many, many texts allegedly by Plato or by interpreters of Plato, as well as magical texts. The person who dives into this is Marsilio Ficino, who translates these texts and calls it the Hermetic corpus. It's attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, allegedly a seer and wise man, a magus, who existed long before the Bible, long before Christ, and yet anticipated all the contents of the Bible and anticipated Christianity. So he's seen as both a philosopher and as a religious figure who holds the first theology, the first truth. Obviously, people, if they got their hands on this, would want to know what's in it, and Ficino translates and makes widely available its key ideas. Among the key ideas is the link between microcosm and macrocosm, between the human body and the wider cosmos. This is contained in the emerald tablet attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. That which is below corresponds to that which is above. Its father is the sun, its mother is the moon, the wind carries it in its belly, its nurses the earth, it is the origin of all. Okay, so basically everything's there. This is the secret explanation of the philosopher's stone. A material and spiritual process that will reveal all the secrets of nature as a whole. The only problem is it's not exactly clear exactly how you go about making it. This is all relatively poetic and suggestive. And Ficino gets people running to try to figure out exactly what it means. He's aided by translating several other texts, the Asclepius, which is about animating statues, bringing statues to life, the Picatrix, which is about talismans, which channel astral forces, and the Pimander, which is a new telling of creation. Unlike in Genesis, right? The story in Genesis is that Adam and Eve are in the garden, and there's a tree of knowledge and a tree of life that they're not supposed to have anything to do with. Stay away from that tree of knowledge. By contrast, in this creation story, in the Pimander, there's a similar making of the earth, of the governors of the planets, the 7 planets who watch over the earth, and of the human. And when the human looks on all of creation, looks at God's creation, he says to himself, I really like this, and I'd like to do this too. And imagines himself as a creator as well, and God says, that's fine, go for it. So rather than being banned from knowledge, this first human is encouraged to learn and to alter the world, to engage with nature and transform it, to carry on the work of God by being a creator or demiurge himself. And that's one of the key lessons that people draw from these works, which also feed into many explorations into magic. Channeling astral forces and using study and various kinds of recipes to alter the natural world, to bring forth occult powers and make use of it. Undergirding it is Neoplatonic philosophy in various forms. In its simplest version, you've got the one, you've got the absolute, the first principle. And then that emanates itself out into successive layers, successive emanations. First, the intellectual principle, the nous, then the soul, which is the emotion, then the natural world, and then finally chaotic matter. So we are contained within this structure of the absolute having dropped and descended itself into base matter. That part of us, which is a soul, yearns to climb back up that ladder and return into union with that one, with that absolute. And Ficino's interpretation of the Hermetic corpus argues that it's possible through various kinds of practices, internal and external practices, to climb back up that ladder and reattain union with these higher spirits and ultimately with the Creator. Another twist on the Neoplatonic corpus shows up in the middle of the 16th century in the works of Paracelsus, who is challenging Aristotelian philosophy, running around preaching and lecturing on his new chemical medicine. He wants to extend the system of elements that already exists, incorporating sulfur, mercury, and salt, and says you can learn about the chemical composition of humans, what chemicals will make them healthy, make them live longer, maybe let them live forever, if you undergo processes of material decomposition and recomposition. He popularizes the techniques of alchemy, melting elements down, merging merging them with others, separating them, rejoining them, watching the transformations, ultimately in order to purify them, in order to make them higher and more noble elements, eventually obtaining the Philosopher's Stone, which makes it possible to take a little bit of a substance which has been acquired, add it to some other metal, and then rapidly turn that into a pure metal, silver or gold. There are clear material benefits of this, right? Limitless amounts of gold, but in the way in which it's presented both by Paracelsus and by the other Neoplatonic readers of Ficino, there's also a spiritual benefit to be derived from this. The purification of metal that you see in alchemical processes is also the purification of the soul through various spiritual practices, and the two go hand in hand. So how are we doing? Still hanging in there? Still kind of warm. That hasn't really changed. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why I don't actually use mercury in my explanations of Paracelsus. So I want to give three case studies of the way in which this view of nature, this cosmology, which is definitely not the mechanical philosophy, right? It's completely different than what Boyle was putting forward. Nevertheless, made use of instruments, made use of machines, and the imagination of machines to advance its claim. Put technology at the center of its cosmology without that cosmology being a mechanical cosmology. So three examples: Coenrath, Camillo, and Flood. Coenrath is responsible for some of the most amazing images available widely in libraries and online now, which show some of the basic ideas around the end of the 16th century of the merging of alchemy with Neoplatonic philosophy, what he calls Rosicrucianism. This is a perfected theology in his view. It is Christianity plus alchemy plus the history of the Kabbalah. Right? Jewish mysticism is part of it as well. The knowledge of the Egyptians is also baked into it. And if you can decode all of these points, you will learn, using the Hebrew letters, you will learn the secrets of creation, because the truth of the Philosopher's Stone is identical to the truth of Christ and his salvation. The transformations you undergo to arrive at the Philosopher's Stone are the same as the transformations, the death and resurrection of Christ. So he merges alchemy and a very engaged spirituality, a universalist Christianity, in these images, in these texts, which are hard to decode, but seem to be putting it all front and center. Likewise, this image, various secrets of his philosophical system are contained in the text, as well as this imagery rising up from the earth, up to the peacock, and ultimately up to God, in the Trinity, up to God. And this imagery, which is of a theological nature, is also very much of an alchemical nature. These colors and images are stages of the alchemical work, right? The white wings, the black head, these are moments that of the transformations of matter as you perform the philosophical work. The peacock feathers, that's a moment where a rainbow is visible in the alembic, in the glass that you're working. So the theological and the material are very closely entwined for Coenrath. And in the same collection, the Amphitheater of Eternal Wisdom, he provides this image, which is literally the place where the magic happens. This is where the alchemist, the seeker after knowledge, does his work. It's divided into three sections, significant. This is the side that belongs to God. This is the side that belongs to nature. And in between is humanity, mankind. So in order to bring about the purifications of matter, which are also purification of the individual spirit, you have to have an oratory. You have to have a place to say your prayers. At the same time, you have to have a laboratory, a place to do your work. Because all the equipment, all the instruments, all the hermetic instruments of the alchemist's trade. Joining these two sides together is a table with other instruments of the fine arts, of music and painting. And these instruments suggest the difficulty of tuning and creating a harmony between the knowledge of nature and the knowledge of God, both of which are necessary for this work. And here, by putting it all together in a single representation, or showing up technology in this amazing print, you are at least pointed towards the secrets required to undergo this work. Along with it are various prayers and repetitions that you should be saying to yourself as you conduct the work. Right? Make haste slowly, even while sleeping. Be vigilant. That which is wisely tried again and again will succeed sometime, and when we attend strictly to our work, God himself will aid us. So this is the same kind of rhythm and attention to inner states, eternal vigilance, that was present in the monasteries in the medieval period, and now it's brought forth into the laboratory as a space for exploring nature, maximizing our engagement with nature, trying things over and over, experimenting with them over and over, for a material outcome, new medicines, new tools, new chemical compositions, but also for a spiritual purpose, self-enlightenment, right? Self-perfection, the purification of the soul. So clearly this is merging, right, a vision of art, it's putting a vision of art at the center of nature, where the material and something like the magical or the spiritual are equally necessary. And putting it together in a way that can be visualized. This is the age, the 16th century, of radical experiments in visualization. Not the 21st century, that's the 16th century. New techniques of visualizing distant worlds, visualizing the world as a whole. So Kunrath is doing that in his amphitheater of eternal wisdom. So too is the Counter-Reformation, right, led by Ignatius of Loyola, creating new works to glorify God, new cathedrals, new forms of painting and representation in the external world, but also in the internal world, decorating it, ornamenting it, enriching it with a series of standardized spiritual exercises, which involve a set of stages for visualizing the truths of the Catholic teaching. So I want to suggest that what's happening in the 16th century is new ways of working on matter, extending our senses, extending matter, right? Opening up new caverns, new spaces. But at the same time, there are new techniques, new tools, new practices that open up the caverns of the inner mind, that expand the interior space of humanity, furnish it with new objects, create new spaces and new experiences. And both of these are happening at once at the start of modernity. So now a little bit of an experiment, a little change of pace. And that's to turn to a second displaying of technology around Hermetic instruments. This is the Memory Theater of Giulio Camillo. And it's written about by Francis Yates in a great book called The Art of Memory, which I can't recommend highly enough. And it's about a system of memory that is based on a space pretty much like this one. It's not clear whether Camillo actually built this machine, or rather just described it, but there are indications that some people tried to replicate it, to make it out of wood, to put it inside a villa. And what is it? Well, it's a construction, both concrete and imaginary, around a circle with gradations going up by stages, 7 stages. Okay? And I'm going to take the liberty of giving a slightly different approach at this point of the lecture and switch from talking and showing to, yes, still talking, but not showing. Okay? So I want to walk you through Camillo's construction, something like the way he meant for it to be used, through a guided internal exercise. And I've heard that this is relatively familiar for most of you in the Matters of Activity group. If you don't want to go along, that's fine. Just take a little break, have a rest, drink some water, check your phone. That's fine. But for the rest of you, this, I think, is probably a useful way to introduce what Camillo is about by walking you through some of the stages of the practice that's at the heart of this memory theater, that the memory theater is meant to train you. So I want you to start by picturing, this is basically like you're looking in a mirror. You're looking at the memory theater. So switch from being in the audience to being at the center of it, looking at it. like where I am, looking out at the stages. Now get that space in your head. Picture that. Think about what it looks like if looking out at that half circle. Now I'm going to black that out. Can't draw the curtain. But I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for a moment. And just picture the space of that theater as a half circle, looking out at the rows going up. I'm not checking to see whether your eyes are closed. Experiment succeeded. Okay. All right. Forget that loud noise you might have heard. It won't happen now. Close your eyes. Imagine that half circle in front of you. The view of the center looking out at the rows going up. This is Camillo's construction. Just in front of you, picture 7 pillars. These are the 7 pillars of Solomon's temple. They also correspond to the 7 measures, or distances, that connect the Earth and its 4 elements to the most distant planet in the outer limit of the universe. Okay. So let's take a moment and tune in to those 4 elements: earth, water, air, fire. Start with earth. It's pretty late in the day. The body probably feels a little bit heavy. You feel it pressing on the seat. Your feet are drawn to the ground. Your shoulders might be tight, so you can drop them and just relax them. Now think about the water element. You can take the breath and let it out. You might feel some moisture in the breath, maybe a little dampness under your nostrils, maybe some sweat on your skin, on your face, maybe on your feet. Water is swishing around in you, it's condensing, misting. Now, tune in to the heat. This is the fire on your skin. It's in your lungs. Maybe it's a little too warm, you feel some discomfort. Maybe you feel this heat is enjoyable, something that you can sink into. Feel the light, feel its energy. Fourth is air. Notice that air going into your nostrils and going back out. Feel it move into your lungs, and going again, back out. Nice and easy. Going back outside to the wind, out the nose, coming back. Now, in your mind, come back to that footnote in front of those 7 pillars. Now picture that. Occupy that internal space the way you were assigned. Just behind these 7 pillars, there are 7 arches or gates. On each of them is a sign for one of the 7 planets. And those planets are feeling their influence in different combinations on each of them, governing our fate. The moon of Diana, Mercury, Venus, the sun of Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each of them has its own properties and domains. Diana connected to Neptune and water. Mercury, seat of thought, knowledge, communication. Venus, love and creativity, passion. Apollo, the sun god, light and knowledge. Mars, anger, violence, competition, fire. Jupiter, the king of the gods, benevolence, force, air. And Saturn, dark and heavy, melancholy, earth, strong and juicy. The signs and images of these gods are on the 7 gates in front of you. In each of the 7 gates, you see 7 graves, like banks of seats in the field, each higher than the one before it, stretching up. Each grave is the same for all of the planets. Each is crowded with familiar but striking images drawn from myth and imagination. Each shows aspects of the universe at each level, as they're affected by each particular planet and by each of its rulers. Now, I want us to move in thought through one of them. We're just going to choose one, and that's the gate of Jupiter. It is the signs of this just and benevolent ruler of the sky, associated with the element of air. They're on the gate. We pass through it. Beyond the gate is the second level. Camillo calls this level the banquet. A feast is spread out like a vast ocean. Wavering inside it are the virtues, the objects, the ethical lessons, the stories, and the natural knowledge of his time. It shows and condenses through stages, through dense visualization, the entire cosmos, the entire cosmology of his time. What's striking is the double movement of both moving upward to go up the stairs, but also going down, because in the classical Vitruvian theater that this is based on, the lowest seats were where the king was. The most important people were lowest, and then as you move further up, it was the peanut gallery. In this case, the same is true, because the most important are the gods, are the planets, and as you move further up, it's descending to the material world. So you're moving up physically, but in terms of the scale of being, you're moving down from the absolute, from the more spiritual to the less spiritual. Camillo contrasts this with the medieval arts of memory, which he says are on arbitrary grounds. For him, these are based on the natural causes and structures of the world. At the same time, these images are extremely ambiguous, very hard to decipher. They're packed in with lots of different resonances. They're striking, but they're hard to make sense of. So it maybe isn't so clear that this is a stable basis of knowledge. Nevertheless, an attempt to contain all the knowledge of the time in one place. On the one hand, it's encyclopedic, the theater of nature and knowledge. There's also a magical dimension, and Yeats really insists on that in walking through these stages, down each of these gateways, you're accessing and summoning the powers and qualities associated with each of these gods. This is a magical technique that brings the qualities of those gods to the person who uses this technique of remembering them, of recalling their existence and their aspects. It shows what's in the world, a fixed world that's discovered and known, but also how you move through it, how you create a worlding with it, and how you transform it via your imagination, by receiving influences, by developing the arts. And again, the interesting duality, which is going up and going down at the same time, shows up with the place of the arts in the story. Right? You start from the pure ground of being, this ocean of unformed matter, and then descend to through matter to art. So of course, art is the endpoint, it's the goal. It's also the beginning, because this is over and over described by Camillo as an art of memory. So art is there at the start, it's also there at the end. It's the lowest, but it's also the highest. In other words, it's at the center and it permeates the entire system. Technology is shown here, and it's a technology of showing. So very rapidly, a last case from a little later, the end of the 16th century, Robert Fludd, who I include because he's so close to Coonrath. Some of his images will be known to you, and also because, of course, he made memory theater too. So he's combining the two strands in his work. He's a physician in England at the end of the century. This is an image that's been widely copied and shown many places, although it's rather baffling. The simple story is it's a cosmogram of a universe centered around art. It's the first page, the frontispiece of his book on both worlds, the major and minor, metaphysical, physical, and technical history. Right? The technical history of the relation between the micro and macro, telling the history of how we move from darkness, carry on to infinity in each direction if you want to see what the eternal darkness looks like, how it's lit up by the divine fiat and the Holy Spirit, and then captured in divisions. That Holy Spirit is captured in divisions of warm and cold, of light and dark, which can be made visible by Hermetic instruments, by the thermometer or barometer, the perpetual motion device, as he called it, the thermoscope that he created, analyzed its risings and fallings according to the weather, and connected them to the structure of the planet as well as the heaven. So this is a microcosmic instrument that shows the relations between the largest system and the individual system, the meteorological changes, the divisions of spirit and matter that happen on Earth for humans. The same logic is there in his celestial monochrome, which is named after instrument, a one-stringed instrument, whose divisions, which sound out thirds and fifths and the octaves, match those measures that connect the planets. And we can hear those relations, we can see them by playing this actual instrument. So a Hermetic instrument that shows the relations of the cosmos, that articulates them, and also symbolizes the entire cosmic system at once. So back to this very dense image, it shows God holding a chain which holds nature, and nature moves the first mover, moves the celestial spheres, and the planets emerge from her body and give birth to the metals in the earth, which then grow from them. But nature, if her hand is held by God, in her hand, she holds a chain that holds this ape. That is the ape of nature who sits on the earth, right? Who rules over the earth. The ape of nature is art. So the vice regent of God's vice regent is human art in the form of this ape. And at the center, literally at the center of the system, are all of the arts. The liberal arts, usually in medieval classifications of the discipline, these are the highest forms of knowledge. Right? The quadrivium, astronomy, and the arts of language. But in fact, there are only the fourth ring. Inside that ring, around the earth, are the arts which supplement, assist, and correct nature, helping in the animal kingdom with medicine, eggs, bee culture, and sericulture, in the vegetable kingdom with agriculture, tilling and tree grafting, and in the mineral kingdom. Right? Closest to the earth, the arts of extracting metals, of transforming metals, of purifying metals, it's alchemy. At the highest art, the most central art, the one that keeps us closest to the earth, and closest to the overall driving force of the image and the driving force of the cosmos as it relates to humans, which is art. So again, it's a cosmology of art, technique, and harmony. Instruments make these changes. They also symbolize and show this unity. This vision of art is at the center of knowledge, at the center of human activity, is translated to Francis Bacon, who makes use of many of the same images and same ideas. And also, some of the same technologies and theories as in the thermoscope are transferred to the new experimental philosophy, like that of Robert. Visually, very similar techniques that work in very similar ways, but machines that are articulated with very different cosmologies. The mechanical philosophy emerging here, the Neoplatonic magical philosophy of flood on the other side. Okay, so you followed it this far. Thanks very much. No one's passed out yet. Conclusion. So to repeat, I showed this slide before. I won't walk you through it. First one, technology is showing, which are also showings of technology, and this duality. Is this a cosmos where the world is discovered, or a cosmos where the world is made? What I wanted to do is make the point that there are continuities, not a radical break, either with the new science of the 17th century, the modern mechanical philosophy, or the most recent technologies of virtual reality. There are themes, there are approaches, there are theories, potential ways of relating to the universe that run through them. I also want to, by stretching our senses historically, revise the narrative of modernity. Instead of focusing on science as the breakthrough, focus on the arts in these early images of the 16th century, that arts are celebrated as the driving force, the defining characteristic of humans, and the driving force of history. These are universes of art. And I want to suggest that even in the 19th century, you can see modern science and industry growing out of what we might call magical arts of imagination, visualization, and transmutation. So rather than the modern sciences and technologies of industry chasing away all the gods and magical thinking of the past, they directly grow out of that thinking and frequently have those same enchanted notions, those same magical ideas, often those same cosmologies floating around them, hovering around them. Every time a new technology shows up, it appears as magic and is celebrated as such. So there's much more going on than simple disenchantment. What we saw in the 16th century and again in the 19th was utopian visions of a malleable, remade world thanks to technology. And it's made possible by new technologies for expanding the human interior. This includes arts of memory, techniques of visualization, and spiritual exercise. Having expanded this inner world, having developed these arts to bring forth those human capacities, those hidden capacities of the human mind, the next step is to deploy them on the natural, on the external world. Not the other way around. It's not that the technology opens up the mind. The mind is expanded and the technologies are there to transform and open up the world. Of course, these imaginative, creative, and even demiurgic powers also enabled conquest, colonization, exploitation, destruction of nature on an unprecedented scale. So on the one hand, we've got a cosmos which is discovered and controlled, and on the other, a cosmos which is made by listening, in interaction, with multiple worldings. And rather than see it as an either-or, I think we should see these as two different ways, which are present in different emphases in these new cosmologies based on art as ways of expanding the inner and working with the outer, creating new worlds. And the question is where that leaves us in thinking about climate change and our relation to nature now, the planetary urgencies that we now face. Is it a work in progress that we just need the right tools to fix? Or is it an extremely strange mixing where the human is radically discentered, no longer recognizes itself, and the basis of control or even knowledge is absolutely unknown? I don't have an answer to that question. I think the exhibition certainly raised that question. How much do these new technologies let us master nature, and how much do they show it as something that's forever beyond our grasp? And I want to end with just one last mythical image, having walked you through Camilla, as one possible thing to think with. And that's the myth, not of the bull and the minotaur, but of Apollo and Daphne. Camillo puts Apollo at the center of his system. It's the center row, and like Ficino, it's a system of sun worship, the power of Apollo, the knowledge, and the control, the rational control of Apollo, he worships. And that sense of control, that sense of grabbing through knowledge, surveying and grabbing what you want, is very much celebrated in the history of science and in the Western tradition that Camillo, despite his peculiarities, is very much a part of. So the myth of Daphne and Apollo is Apollo, the god, sees the nymph Daphne, chases her through the forest. She's horrified. She wants nothing to do with this demanding god, and screams, "Help me. Open the earth to enclose me, or change my form, which has brought me into this danger. Let me be free of this man from this moment forward." Hearing her call, a heavy numbness seizes her limbs. Her breasts are surrounded by a thin bark. Her hair changes into foliage. Her arms change into branches. Her foot, just now swift, now clings to sluggish roots. She's turned into a laurel tree. Evergreen laurel tree, always green, part of the earth. Now, I'm not saying the solution to the challenge of climate change is to turn into a tree, but there's something about this response, this gracious transformation of horror at the exploitation that humans have done to each other and to the earth, with a kind of refusal, a kind of staying put, of a stopping of motion, and connecting with roots to the elemental forces of life in the earth. I don't know exactly what form that takes, but that kind of ambiguity, I think, is going to be useful in thinking about the worldings that we still have to perform. Thanks. Thank you. You've all been extremely patient. And it's quite warm, and that was a long talk. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
Exactly. For the questions, for the audience that is streamed and for the recording, we will ask you to speak in the microphone for the questions. Thank you very much, John. It's been an amazing, mind-blowing story. And yeah, yeah, you would like to, yeah. So we have a question by Claudia Marais.
Thank you so much. So I really also tried to get my head around about this really fantastic and also so stimulating overview, really from Stuart Brand back to Camilo's Memory Theater. That was really fantastic. So thank you a lot. I'm still trying to make my sense out of like exactly this division you've just again presented to us between like just looking in my notes. Yeah, a cosmos discovered and controlled as the world, or a cosmos made in the interaction, a way of worlding. And obviously you also said it yourself in the end, it's like a kind of an intertwinement also of this kind of world making. And especially wondering, so I'm doing my research in the field of design, and there especially when we talk about design, so we are always like in the in-between, so it's always a kind of a rationalization and a kind of objectification of the world, but it's always a kind of a worlding too. So I wonder whether you would switch your perspective a little bit from technology to making these words, like really designing these words, also in material practices. How would you then put these two differences together, or these two different ways of?
One of the exciting things about the way the 16th century uses the term arts is that it doesn't separate between what we would call technology and what would now be called design or fine arts. So the theories about how new natures are drawn forth, how we engage with them through painting or sculpture or design or architecture are very similar, they're the same as the theories for how we work with production, with bookmaking, with weaving. So I would say that there isn't any fundamental difference between the two. If we're going to draw this theory of art that goes from the 16th century forward, which I think, given the way that the sciences now work frequently, technology is not applied science. Technology has its own logic, has its own way of working, and in a way that I see as having both a historical priority and increasingly an epistemological priority over the knowledge that's claimed as kind of pure knowledge of causes in the sciences. So I would just push I would push the distinction away, push the kind of uniting of the expansion of technology, or merge with it more of the thinking that's, let's say, the making, the unexpected, the creative, that's part of design, show that as part of technology as well. This is partly a story not just of lowering the idea of pure philosophy as driving these changes, but also elevating the sense of art as really the fundamental skill and ability of humans. Thanks.
It's interesting because I've studied a little bit later this period of time, but more regarding sociology, the effects of technology and so on, regarding agriculture in particular, and population numbers. But my question is, Galileo didn't come up, and there was not a lot of reference to the Christian Church of Europe, the Catholic Church of Europe, and its direct effects on people, the scientists, the alchemists. So references to the church, or for instance, how things were in that time. I don't like, admittedly, I'm not so sure how that would affect what you're lecturing about. But for me, it was just thinking of Galileo and so on. So just if you have any thoughts on that.
Thanks for the question. Where's Galileo and where's the church in this? I'm focusing very particularly on a very narrow set of actors. I'm fascinated by these figures around 1600, the Rosicrucians, who really seem to be setting the stage for a lot of the transformations that show up, especially in the sciences of the North. There are other roots, other traditions. Part of what links Galileo to the networks that Coenrath and Flood are part of, and before him, Camillo and people like Della Porta, is the connection to the court, to courts, right? That there is a kind of art to performing knowledge, to explaining how things work, to working with new instruments. And the divine Galileo, like the divine Camillo, is celebrated for his discoveries, but also for his inventions. So that same kind of merging of the arts and the sciences through craft, through working with materials, working on lenses, coming up with new experiments, it's really there as a precursor to Galileo as well. Of course, he runs into trouble with the church, notoriously, right? He's brought before the Inquisition for teaching things against the Bible. That's also a big part of the background here, especially for those Rosicrucian Hermetic scientists like Coonrath and Flood. Part of what they're trying to do with these new universal systems of art, of theories of art, of cosmologies grounded on art, is to overcome the divides between the Protestants and the Catholics. Because the religious wars are in full effect, right? There have been multiple battles between different interpretations of Scripture. They're arguing for a new way of interpreting Scripture to connect the wisdom of the Egyptians, the Hebrews, the true interpretation of the Bible, which is going to be active, which is not going to be just about preaching, but it's going to be about let's work together to build the new world. That's part of the claim. Some people have shown that the new sciences of the 17th century had a similar kind of utopian ambition. Let's stop fighting about religion. We can all agree on science, and let's move forward. That's very much what Boyle is about. I'm saying that same kind of movement is happening in an earlier generation, at the start of the 17th century, in Flood and Coonrath, and instead of saying it about science, they're saying it about art. This is what we all share. This is what we can agree on. This is how we can work together and overcome these divides. But obviously, definitely, the church is a big part of this story. It's in the background. One more person I'd throw in, which some of you have come across who work on light and shadow, who work on visual technologies, is Athanasius Kircher, who's a Jesuit from the middle of the 17th century, okay, the 1600s, who uses many of the technologies and many of the explanations of these wonder-producing machines that Coonrath and Flood are throwing together, and uses it not as a kind of new synthesis of Protestant and Catholic, but as a radical demonstration of the power of God and the power of the Catholic Church. So what Loyola is doing a century earlier in creating this inner pageant of the power of God for all the Jesuits and all the converts through his spiritual exercises, Kircher is performing in the external world with these incredible demonstrations of light and shadow, of magnetic force, natural magic in the service of Catholic theology.
Thank you so much. That's just great to listen to you. I was just keeping to this, like these wonder-producing machines. I mean, you also showed like the example of the trade fairs in the mid-19th century, and obviously those also were like kind of wonder machines, like, you know, bringing up a lot of kind of new material wonders. And you especially stressed, which I found super intriguing, like how modern science and industry grow out of a magical understanding of art and imagination, even in those times of industrialization, right? And that this magic somehow kept on going. But then you could also say, yeah, but where does it keep going? I mean, it's also in the commodity and in the fetish of the commodity, right? So is there this whole dimension of the commodity and the commodification that somehow carries this wonder further on as a kind of, I don't know, like attunement or attractment to the goods and to the consumer goods. So how would you then put this like kind of political economy in your panorama of science and art against the backdrop of like industrialization and this kind of, you know, new way of channeling the magic, I would say. I mean, which of course is problematic in terms of the Anthropocene, right? So.
In questioning the narrative of disenchantment, right, that the idea that we ever got disenchanted, I'm also kind of putting the idea of commodity fetishism somewhat at distance as well, because in a sense the idea that, you know, the magic in commodities, right, the impression of magic that comes from commodities that Marx defines as commodity fetishism is an error, right? That's what he's saying. It's a mistake. I'm trying to say, well, it's actually quite a reasonable interpretation by people who are stunned by new products, by new experiences, and so that's one qualification I'd give. I think there is a genuine experience of wonder that new technologies like virtual realities, right, bring. And trying to debunk them and replace them with what's really going on misses the reality of what they actually are. That's one thing. I'd say, though, that the only fetishism, commodity fetishism is not the only fetishism in the modern age. There are all kinds of senses of magic, of enchantment that happen even in nature, right? Even the theory of enchantment continues in Romantic literature about nature, right? What you can experience is, in the real world, is something semi-magical. And likewise, trying to clear that away, saying it's just an error, and the reality is just the physical relations or the social and economic relations, misses a central point of what this actually means for humans, and feeds into the kind of narrative of mechanical, material objectivity, that there's only one world, and it's a dead world that exists for us to control. I'm all for arguing against people lying to others, to deceiving them with fake magic and with delusions. But at the same time, not all magic is the same. And that sense of wonder is essential to human life and drives the things that we value most. So that's a kind of long-winded answer to the question, but obviously commodification is a way through which some of these wonders reach a broader audience. One more thing I'd say is that the 17th century, the 16th and 17th century wonder makers are also selling books, and they're trying to get positions at court. So it's not as though commodification is absent from that earlier moment either.
Thanks. I'm just wondering about that particular picture with the ape sitting on top of the world. So that's, the way I understand it, it's an image of art or culture as opposed to God's creation, which is nature, right? So it's kind of an interesting, I just thought it was an interesting kind of, because you actually take something from nature to become a metaphor for and you lift it in to become a metaphor for culture then. So it's like this kind of entanglement between the two worlds is somehow existing in that gesture. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, because in the very, if you to represent culture, then you take something from nature, which is the ape is very often used as the very image of nature, as an unspeaking, being, let's say, and then you lift that to represent the human, which is peculiar. So, and I guess that the word aping is also strange because it's somehow mimesis. So the very fundament, if mimesis is a kind of a fundament of human culture, let's say, then it's peculiar that word aping is the same. I mean, I'm just curious if you have any reflections on that kind of entanglement there.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Thank you. And it is puzzling. It gets very complicated because if you're trying to define art as different from nature, in some way, right, which it is, you're enhancing nature, but on the other hand, you're trying to say that art is a continuation of nature and an improvement of nature. What images do you choose for that? And absolutely, the ape is an extremely ambiguous one. So you're totally right to point that out. I would say another place we can go to kind of think about that complication would not only be about the relation between, say, fetishism and reality, as in the case of commodities, that there are in fact lots of different kinds of fetishism and lots of degrees of fetishism and lots of degrees of reality that are showing up. That was part of my answer to the previous question. But the same is true, lots of degrees and differences of forms of artifice in relation to nature. And so it's tracking those changes that I think you need to do. Not to assume there's one thing that's nature on one side and artifice on the other, but see how they get entangled, as you say. One other place that I would go to try to make sense of this, it's just to point to another paradox, which is there in the Neoplatonic system, that Camillo walks you through, right? From spirit emanating down to matter. On one hand, everything that exists participates in pure spirit, participates in God, participates in the absolute. Everything is an emanation of God. And yet, everything exists at its own degree of being, at its own degree of perfection. So how can both of those things be true? That it's all one, right? It's all the same force of creation, and yet there are significant gradations. And we can also move through those gradations, and I think in some of these ways of putting it, we can also shift those gradations, right? The lines are not permanent, right? You can move through them, and you might be able to shift the categories. But that's answering a puzzle with a paradox, which I don't think is necessarily inappropriate for this period, or maybe even for these questions about what art is in relation to nature. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. I just have a last question. I think we're running out of time, unfortunately, but it's more of a practical question. As an anthropologist and also as curator, we're doing this festival, we are sometimes very tempted to bring up terms like magic of alchemy, and it seems like it's something that is extremely difficult, perilous to do. I'm very admirative that you do it, but you do it also from the angle of an historian, which is way easier than saying that I do observe magic. These people in the neurosurgery in Charité, they predict things and they heal people. You know, they are doing something very intriguing. And of course, it's all going through the greed of modern science. And it seems almost impossible to use these categories. Although it's also my profession, I'm an anthropologist, I'm a professional anthropologist, I'm supposed to know what magic is, and when I see magic, I'm supposed to, be able to say it's magic. But it seems like it's very difficult, very, difficult place. So do you have an explanation for that, maybe? And how can you help me out there, John, please?
Yeah, no, that's a similar puzzle, and I think a similar answer, that when that term is used, or when that term comes to mind, when you're inclined to use that term. Why? What is the situation? And then exactly that hesitation, that sense, I can't say this. Well, what does that point out? What fault line, what kind of ontological divide have you just tripped over? And are there ways around it? Are there other terms you can use? I mean, people are using the term in all kinds of ways. We say it's metaphorical, we say it's just a manner of speaking, but the experience that some of these wonders produce is absolutely genuine. I don't have an answer to this question. I think studying that question is really extremely interesting. I think one helpful thing that I've found, stretching back to the past, is to realize that even at the time when people believed in magic, like Ficino and afterward, or Camillo, there were also lots of people who believed magicians were frauds, and there were also lots of frauds. So you can have many degrees of believing and many different ways of believing, even in the era when people thought magic was real, right? So maybe that isn't so different than where we are now, right? There are some things which are more magical than others which are more susceptible to deceit or deception, and others which are just outright frauds. So magic, I think, is still an extremely useful term for social analysis, and it's especially a useful term when people use it in everyday life, right? That, as anthropologists, I think you're very right to stop on that term and think, why are they using it, and why can't I use it? And maybe think about it. I don't know. I agree.
Thank you so much, John, for this lecture and your time and the attention of everyone. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Yunha and all the members of the Stretching Sensi School to say hi to the camera. Please come downstairs to have a little bit of applause, please, Paulina. Yeah. Yes. It's a celebration. Yeah, it's good. So, thank you so much for all these creative energies, for all these amazing things that we've been through. It's been quite a ride, and I hope this is also a beginning for something that can move on. So, yes, Yuna, come with us. And this is a kind of, you know, dispositive to get some applause. So please, I would like you to applaud the Stretching Sensi School. Of a few members of them. Thank you very much, and Houston, you can cut the connection. Yeah, and I wish you all a very beautiful evening, and we'll stay a little bit.